Mining on the moon is on the horizon. But who decides who can mine, what can be mined, and how much mining is too much? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we talk with Dr. Sharei and Dr. Filijović, who have a proposal that in a United Nations Parliament regulates mining on the moon. Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Chai on the Moon, where we discuss issues related to the future settlements on the moon, especially the societal and cultural issues. Today, we have two guests with me. Marko Filijović. He's a PhD in security studies. He's a specialist in outer space security, geopolitics, and resources, and a research fellow at the Center for UN Constitutional Research in Brussels. He also serves on the editorial boards of the International Law Research Journal in Canada and a Journal of Political Science and International Relations. We also have with us Dr. ShahrYar Mahmoud Sharei. He's a PhD in international law. He's a principal in the UN Charter and Global Governance. He is currently the executive director of the Center for UN Constitutional Research, CUNCR, in Brussels. And that's where we are today. So, Drs. Filijović and Dr. ShahrYar Mahmoud Sharei, welcome to Chai on the Moon.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So, one of the reasons why I invited you was to have a conversation about an article you recently wrote. This was in Space News. And so it is with me. I printed it out. I still like printing stuff out. So, not good for the environment, but good for reading. And the opinion piece was the UN needs to form a parliament to regulate space mining. This is obviously this is a issue that is coming up more and more in terms of exploration of space and especially on the moon as well. But I'm just curious. Can you tell me a little bit about what prompted that article?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Salman, for inviting us. It's really a hot day here in Brussels, very unusual, like 30 degrees. And we are not equipped, no air conditioning, and we got to get prepared for climate change. But the climate change also is a problem, global problem, where we call it existential problem. And space, we think, especially with militarization of space, and let alone the resource management of it, is an existential threat. And we have more existential threats, unfortunately, as we speak. Two big wars and seven or eight smaller wars, and it depends what you call by big and small, are going on. Gaza, Palestine, and Israel, and Ukraine Russia war. And these are all global existential problems. And we have more, but this is enough, I think. But they have a convergence in terms of their solution, in terms of how you approach them. And in case of space, what prompted me personally, and of course my colleague here, Marco, may have had a different angle of looking at things, was the absolute dysfunctional nature of Security Council when it just came to two space issues, and one was, of course, you must have heard that Russia is trying to do some nuclear tests in the space, and this prompted USA, and they allied with Japan, which is right now on the Security Council as a non-permanent member, and they brought a resolution on non-proliferation of space under the nuclear non-proliferation category, and that was vetoed by Russia, single veto, and that was Russia. I think China abstained. Then the Russians, with collaboration with the Chinese, brought another resolution. That second resolution, like a couple of weeks later, was related to demilitarization of the space. In other words, okay, not nuclear wars, no nuclear bombs in space, but not even conventional or like laser beams shooting down missiles or satellites. So this got voted no, vetoed by US, Japan, and a couple of other countries. So we had two very important existential issues at the Security Council, both of them failing in terms of being humanity and the planet in mind rather than the national interest or paranoia of each other in mind. And this failure in global governance is not just in space, as I mentioned, in many of our existential threats, including artificial intelligence, AI. And this was my main motivation, which we get to, I guess, hopefully, the few other questions, that to bring up the bigger issue of global governance of space. If you want to add
That's
to
yeah, Marco. If you can.
it.
So, so I'm just curious because I actually found your op-ed, uh, I mean, if I can say so, provocative, because it talked about sort of like, I mean, in some sense, restructuring the UN. Can you say a little bit about what you are arguing in there in terms of what can be done? How can UN be more effective? What are you arguing for?
Yes, you have keen eyes, and that was the whole idea. It was supposed to be thinking out of the box. Actually, it's within the legal framework work of the box, but for international law and global governance, it's out of the box. And here's the thing: when the state uh, doesn't have government, like Libya, Somalia, Haiti, we call it a failed state. But the world, the planet, does not have a government. Unfortunately, a lot of people think UN is like a world government, but it's not. There is no legislation, there is no people representation or voting. The president or secretary general is not elected, is appointed. They don't have financing, they don't have robust court system. So this is what most people miss, and including our leaders, where they think, okay, we've got the laws, we got international law, people just don't follow, or the governments or the states don't follow. We've got these bad or rogue states. But the point is, there is no uh, international, uh, government. There is no elections. There is no legislation. And if we want to have some sort of regulation on space or agreement, it has to be robust. It has to be legitimate in terms of lawmaking. So it has to be driven from the people, but to be realistic, in conjunction with states. Like, for example, the United States has both the Congress, the Senate, which is states representatives, and the House of Representatives, which is the people. And that's what missing in the global stage. And the introduction of a UN parliament, because again, most people think General Assembly is a parliament, but actually it's not. It's this 193 states with very little power, and then Security Council sits on the top. So your point is right. We wanted to get attention and bring some argumentation and logic for the need for a world parliament in the context of
So can I
space and more. Yes.
Yeah, so can I ask you a question? I mean, are you talking about restructuring of the UN for everything, or are you talking about the UN Parliament when it comes to space?
Well, another question, at the center, we've done quite a few years of research on this topic. Um, we are saying we want a UN parliament, right?
Okay.
But that said, brings a lot of complication. What's going to happen to Security Council? Who's going to be, the main decision maker? What's going to happen to the veto? Okay, if there is a legislation, how are the national governments bound to that legislation? Who's going to enforce it? Where is the court
Yeah.
to educate this kind of process or governance system? So, in our opinion, the UN has never had a charter review. It has never reviewed its constitution. Whereas Article 109, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter, which we call San Francisco Promise, requests the Permanent Five to have a set date for review of the charter. Because even back then, in 1945, the smaller nations knew that this Security Council is an apartheid system, is doesn't make sense, it's not on equal pairs, and this is not going to work. The argument, the Permanent Five, remember, they're the winners of World War II. They're, the fact that they are superpowers is not because of their population necessarily or because of their, economic power. So it's basically based on the fact that they were the winners of World War II. So this architecture was supposed to be changed in Article 109, Paragraph 3. But the review conference or the review of the Constitution never happened, and this didn't occur. Now, to summarize, if this constitutional convention takes place, this review conference takes place, in our opinion, or at least mine, based on our research, is going to encounter many, many obstacles that how to solve the global problems. And then finally, they are going to conclude that we need a government, that we are a failed world state. We don't have a government. There is no judge. There is no, the
Yeah.
people representation. So, in order to install the parliament, you need to change the whole charter. This is more, but it's not going to happen in the first, irritation of the charter review. The experience, the historical experience, a recent one would be the European Union, where we are in Brussels. We are the capital of the European Union. 27 countries are member states, and they were right here behind us. In 40 kilometers is Waterloo, where the Napoleonic Wars and the state wars were happening, and 2,000 people were dying an hour based on the statistics they collected. So the point is, in the European Union historical perspective, this happened gradually. They have a parliament now. European Union has a parliament, but they didn't have it before. It was the common market. It was kind of like the UN. Didn't have enforcement. Didn't have a court system. Didn't have independent financing. But gradually, through their conventional reviews, they called it treaty reviews. The last one being in Lisbon. Before that, the important one being the Maastricht Treaty. They gradually switch, and now we have a supranational government for the 27 European Union countries.
I love the bit about that. I mean, we often talk about space as changing humanity, right? Like, space as something that we will have to reevaluate how things are done. And I really, what struck me reading your piece was, I mean, I think you are turning it on its head. And what you are arguing that, well, here is a problem which actually really makes the need for UN Parliament or the UN to change because of how we think about space. I think it's a really interesting connection. And so if I can come back to it a little bit more from the space perspective, everybody has signed, almost every country is a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It's an old treaty. I think everybody also agrees that it doesn't really fit in because it was in 1967. It is ambiguous deliberately. One of the reasons why everybody signed on to it. So, as a say, for example, if I can get into an argument with you, what I can argue is like, well, the direction of changing the UN or for space mining, because ultimately that's where we restarted the conversation with, that's a much harder path. Why not argue that we can make the outer space treaty clearer in terms of laws regarding space mining, rather than argue for a change in the UN structure.
May
You
I?
wanna? Yeah, sure.
Well, to kind of attach to the previous question, well, because the space is the final frontier, and I
Right.
like to tell this story. I was thinking about it. So either you're a cosmonaut or an astronaut or a taikonaut, it doesn't matter. You stay there in the International Space Station. You get up in the morning, having coffee or what they have there. You look at the window and you see the globe. You don't see borders, you don't see nations, you don't see flags, you don't see different languages. You see this blue marble, and then you look in the other window and you see that vast space. And then you start thinking, how should that be organized? I mean, if you go back to history, the old Sumerians, they had this idea of cosmopolitanism. They were all citizens of cosmos, not just citizens of Earth or some nation or some state or town.
Yeah.
They are much larger, and they didn't have this level of technology development we have today. So why space? Because space mining is just around the corner, and we need to act accordingly. So if we want to prepare as a human race to go there, mine or whatever, we need to have a system, and that needs to be regulated. And imagine the world when you're doing that, and you have like, oh, I'm a Chinese, I want to do this, or I'm an American, I want to do that, and then you have misinterpretations, you have different how you understand the law, how you interpret the law, and that's why. If you have a global act, if you have a global government, even parliament, and then you have a global act, then everything is clear. Everybody knows how to behave there in space. Space mining, is it good or not? That's another issue. But it's not only economy, it's not only politics, it's a philosophy of human race. What do we want to see ourselves in the future, and how do we behave in space? That's why.
To add to
But yeah.
Marco's comments and kind of tie it to your question, if I understood it correctly, that you were asking why not work on the existing treaties and make them work rather than change the UN. And the fact that is, since World War II, we have had several hundred treaties on different topics. And the typical assumption in a treaty is the sovereignty of state, not the people, the state. And with the sovereignty of states, in most cases, except the permanent five, it's which they have absolute. For theirs is shared within their treaty. Um, so the Outer Space Treaty that you mentioned, I think has like 115 member countries. But if you look at the statistics, I think half of them or less than half of them have actually ratified it. People don't know that, but treaties have two stages. By just signing, celebration, photos, that doesn't, make it happen. You have to supposedly ratify, which a lot of countries, unfortunately, which disagree with the treaty, but they want to show good public relations. They sign, they take the pictures, they go home, they never ratify. That's one big issue, ratification. The other one is just on the Outer Space Treaty, there is withdrawal clause. That means you easily, at the right time, at the right moment, get out. I mean, for your self-interest. For example, let's say the Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT). Korea, after they tested the bomb, they said goodbye. We're leaving the treaty, and there is really no precautions for them or any kind of penalty. Now, Russia.
If I can add, just well, recently in the states, in the Congress, there was a mention of possibility that because this potential deployment of some kind of a nuclear weapon, nobody knows what it is, from Russia to outer space, there was a conclusion from the American side that Russia might go out of the outer space treaty soon. And there's another point, there's history. So no matter if you sign and if you ratify, for example, after Tiananmen incidents back in the 80s, China was excluded from outer space cooperation. It was practically forced to develop its own program, to set up rules, technology, and now when they're coming big and very advanced, now, oh, let's see what we can do and argue. And also, they have their own interpretation of the outer space treaty, like the Artemis Accords in the United States. Russia also sees Artemis as an endangerment. Uh, I was just on the phone the other day, yesterday, with my friends in Vienna. The UN Congress is about space, actually about moon, going on as we speak. And they told me the biggest argument from the Russian and Chinese side was that Artemis Accord is not a multilateral international program. That their program is the program and more in the UN spirit, while Artemis is more bilateral. So it's a bit of a politics now, an interpretation of how you're going to mix that in politics. But everything is interconnected. So conflicts lead to this isolation of China from outer space cooperation, and that history is not easy to overcome. So now we have this situation in which we are. Again, like Dr. Sharei said, if we had a parliament, a government, we have it would be much easier to resolve all these issues.
Right, and just to complement what was said, in the Outer Space Treaty, from what I recall, there is no court system. So this
Right.
totally makes the law optional. It's like you say, okay, let's everybody agree we are not going to pass any stop signs in our traffic and in our driving, but then there is no police, there is no penalty, there is no court. So it becomes optional, which means not serious, not really binding. Um, and yeah, the withdrawal clause, which is in almost all the treaties, and the fact that they are unenforced. Like for example, some older treaties have enforcement, like kind of enforcement, like the law of the sea. Law of the sea has its own court, but China just was a couple of years ago was found guilty in terms of the uh, islands that they took over from Philippines. But so you had the court, but you didn't have enforcement. So what? I mean, this happened, but China, didn't take any action because there was no enforcement. So even if there is the court, it needs the enforcement, and these are basically what are lacking in international treaties. And the other fact is that who makes the laws, since they're the states and the people are not making the laws, legitimacy issue is also there. So this is the difference
I mean, so
between
to,
having the UN as a sway,
yeah.
like a government light versus working with the existing treaties or new treaties.
Yeah, so to me, it seems like, I mean, this is a much bigger challenge, which again, you pointed it out in there, because it's more about that even if you have a treaty, you can give it a year's notice and then withdraw from it for outer space treaty, for example. But then you also have the Moon Accord, which I think comes closer to what you are suggesting. Again, in terms of space mining, that the UN, there is an executive body that decides whether somebody should mine or not. But only I think 17 countries even signed it. Forget about ratifying it. That wasn't even signed, and none of the major space countries, for example, signed that. Uh, so, I mean, if I can just press on you on a very specific context again for space mining thing, and we're going to come back to the broader UN issue in a second. But there is an op-ed piece just in fact, we are recording on the 27th, so just yesterday actually, in Space News. I'll put that one up as well. It says, the title is "Space Mining Doesn't Need More International Regulations from the UN." And this is in direct response to your article, and this is written by CEO and co-founder of Orbital Mining Corporation, Chris Stolten. And his point is that, well, you are adding more hurdles to it, and in some sense, space is a new frontier, like, for startups as well. And that, instead of encouraging, and again, I'm putting the hat of startup CEO, which I know I normally don't, but let me put my hat on a startup CEO and say, this is going to solve humanity's energy crisis, energy problems by mining, for example, helium 3 on the moon or other things. But if you put more regulations, it's going to discourage it, so it's going to create a problem, right? So how do you respond to that in the context that I mean, there is always this tension whenever something new comes in, the regulations versus encouragement to go ahead and experiment. So how do you respond to that criticism of Chris Stoughton?
Yeah. Well, we don't think this is going to be more regulation. Actually, if you have a UN Parliament, you have a government, you make one global act, it's going to be one regulation, equal for everybody. Everybody will be encouraged to go to other space to develop any resource, any potential which is good for humanity. Uh, I suppose from a perspective of a startup, because nobody yet brought anything from space and sold it, to Earth, make money out of it. But that's the plan, and there are trillions of dollars in the game. But this actually should be to make it more simple. This is not to complicate. This is complicated. This situation where we don't know what is the right interpretation. One person can say this is, one nation can say this organization is going to say something third. And that's what makes this more complicated and less understandable. If you have one global act, if you have clear rules, who can go, what are conditions, and so on. You also know that there are many nations which has like national regulation, like Emirates or Luxembourg or Japan and the United States. Who knows? Maybe there will be more nations said, "Oh, I have my own national legislation." That is complicating. If we have a UN Parliament, we have one global act. It's simple. It should actually make things much easier for the startups and encourage them to go to space. Maybe we didn't explain that right here
Right.
sufficiently, but yeah.
But
Okay,
if I
if I
can
may
say, I
add
mean,
to that,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may add to that, of course, this is a private company, and the private companies always have short-term interest in mind, especially their executives,
Right.
because they're not going to live forever. Where we talk about heritage of mankind in terms of space, and mankind benefiting equally, fairly from the resources of space. So there is business versus government sort of issue here, and that we cannot solve. That always would be there. The business wants no regulation. They want to do everything. They want to quickly make profit, and to be honest, a lot of times they don't care about social responsibility. Um, and we have seen this in climate change. We've seen it, with the oil companies and many, many other companies. So unless there is regulation, they're not going to strain themselves, sacrifice their profit for the common good of the society
Right.
or the world. So in that respect, we understand where he's coming from. But in terms of even for him, I mean, for his children's, right now it's not going to make much difference in the next 10 years, let's say. But for his children and the future of mankind and humanity, if each country, each state acts as total sovereign and wants to own the space, and that's what they want to do. They want to be the first, and they want to own it, and they want to take the first mining out. Or if it's militarization, even worse. It impacts others. So this plundering of our resources can only be regulated through some sort of democratic government, some sort of people oriented government, which we don't have at the global level. And maybe UN can one day be that, but it's not that right now. In terms of the UN does a lot of good things. We love the UN, like in their humanitarian aids, a lot of scientific work. But when
Yeah.
it comes to governance, when it comes to war and peace, when it comes to existential issues, totally dysfunctional.
Well, but I think that's where, for example, somebody who's linked with the United States, I actually don't exactly know where his company is based in, but one of the, American laws that were passed, legislation under President Obama. First, it was an executive act, and I think then it was passed by the Congress as well. That was the encouragement for mining. And one of the things there was, again, this ambiguity regarding outer space treaty. And one way of circumventing that was allowing a company to make profit off of the extracts from there. So this goes back to the heart of the mining thing. And it says, well, if there is an American company, it goes out, digs out something, and make a profit out of that. They don't own it, but they can make profit off of the extract. Now, I can see your arguments, both of your arguments, and you go like, well, it would be easier in some sense if there is a UN parliament or there is a larger body that is deciding that. But from the perspective of uh, this company and from the perspective of the history, which is not good, but the perspective is, well, right now Americans can say, and they don't have to be bound by the outer space treaty as well. I mean, they can also pull out, and they go like, well, these are the rules that we are putting in place. Artemis Accord has that provision. Artemis Accord has been signed by 43 countries, I think, right now, the current total. Maybe it's going to go to 50 or 60. And we are going to use this approach. Now, China can disagree to it, or Russia can disagree to it, but how are you going to respond to this when the US and its allies can say 50 countries have signed, and we agree that if somebody extracts, they can make profit? How are you going to reverse that particular thinking? Because that would require a lot of sort of like, a really foundational change.
Well, with educating people, education is the many people don't know what are the possibilities. So, for example, have you ever heard for a guy named Kardash and Kardash Scale?
Yeah.
So you know what that means. The guy
Yeah.
mathematically
If
came
you
to the
can you
conclusion that
say, can you say it in a few words? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Practically, he's a mathematician, a Russian mathematician who came to the conclusion that the level of development of one civilization can be measured by the resources they use. So what they do now, we are not even in the scale. We use unrenewable resources like coal, like oil, like gas. Helium-3 is just another coal. So their best plan of this humanity is to go and dig up the moon from the regolite, bring it down to Earth, and sell it to the highest bidder. I mean, if this is the highlight of this civilization, then we have a problem. So you have other solutions. For example, after Fukushima incident in Japan, there is this corporation, also a corporation, called Shimizu, and they developed a very futuristic project. Back then, it was like more than 10 years ago now, but they said, let's make a lunar ring, a solar ring on the moon. So their plan was to put solar panels in the moon, and there's a technology I can tell you a bit about it. But the long story short is that you don't dig anything, you don't do anything which is unsustainable. You make a lot of energy. For example, Earth is consuming, by some data, 10 years ago, it was consuming like 15 terawatts of energy. And 13 terawatts of it could be produced just from the lunar ring project. So there's a solution. And that kind of a solution implies that all nations work together. So you ask the question, oh, Americans in Artemis Accords, they're going to do this and place their own lunar station. But then Russian and Chinese, they're going to place their own lunar station. What can happen? Either they cooperate or they fight for those limited resources. But imagine combining those efforts. Imagine combining the best scientific practice, the best solutions. They're going to tell you there are problems with Lunar Ring project, but there are other problems with helium-3 and how to make energy from that too, even bigger. So imagine combining all those resources. Imagine that the UN functions like a whole, you have a parliament, you have a global act, and then you decide to take this very benign approach and use the best of nature, solar energy. You don't dig anything, you don't have to fight, and you solve energy crisis on Earth. How many good things? But why?
Yeah.
That's the answer to your question. Follow the money, and
In terms of CUNCR or the center, which we are more interested in the process of solutions rather than the solution itself and change sort of management or
Hmm.
change theory. In that respect, in response to your question, I personally wouldn't get involved in any details. That what's the U.S. regulation, what's the Moon Treaty regulation in terms of what percentage, for example, gets to be held by the private company or the country mainly sponsoring. It's the in this type of scenario where UN becomes like a government, which it's not right now, then it's multi-layered. The governance is multi-level and multi-layered. You have heard multilateral a lot, but it's not multilateral. Multilateral means like the Moon Treaty. Only a few countries, but universal, it needs to be universal. So in the for example, a good example is actually US, where you are, and all the federal systems are like that. So if California wants to encourage space exploration, does all kinds of subsidies, tax reductions, and all kinds of help, right? So under a UN parliament, it doesn't get prevented. California still does that. And our friend, who want to, explore and invest a lot of money and energy, they're welcome to do it, and they get the profit. So UN or the top level government, let's say EU, the European Parliament, doesn't interfere with the domestic affairs of France, Belgium, etc. in terms of their regulations, their taxation, same as the US federal government. So then it goes one level higher. It goes at the regional level, let's say. And in case of Europe, it's the 27 countries. Then it goes one level higher at the global. Let's not use the word international, global, the global governance, or government. So in that respect, there is two principles which EU uses. One is called complementarity, and the other one is subsidiarity. And these ensure that if a rule and a regulation can be made at the lowest level, the top level should never interfere. So if it's tax advantages, if there is whatever subsidies, etc., the local government can do is only through the global one, where one side may get in conflict of interest with another state. That's where the international and the World Parliament would get involved. So basically, to summarize, the world government parliament, the UN parliament would have very little legislation, very little. It's all left to the countries, but they are the guardians of the ultimate, humanity, global humanity, or the heritage of humanity as far as outer space, and whatever regulations applies there.
So
Right, the framework.
if I can, right, so if I can follow up on that. So okay, so if the US passes this law, like what the Artemis Accord argues, um, and you have the UN Parliament, if the UN Parliament says, how would it respond to the space mining question if there is a split in the UN Parliament? So, would there be a vote regarding that in your mind, whether somebody can own an extract or not, can make profit off out of the extract or not, or would it leave it? Okay, well, this is the United States legislation at the down below level, and the Parliament, if it doesn't come to any clear cut decision, the US position stays. How would it practically play out in your mind, differences of different legislations regarding questions about, for example, mining on the moon?
Well, I give instead of giving exact, a solution again, I give a structural answer. The structural
Okay,
answer
yes.
is that, yeah. So when we got the parliament, it's represented by the people. They decide what is to the best of everybody, not a single country. and not in a treaty where it's not enforceable, and the treaty is usually taken advantage by the big country. For example, if US and European Union can afford to do a lot of space exploration, what happens to Bangladesh? What happens to
Yeah.
Kenya? What happens to Indonesia? What happens to Latin American countries? So we want to be fair to the we want to recognize a world citizen, which we don't have a recognition. We only have recognition of our citizenship in our countries. We don't have global citizenship concept. So with the World Parliament comes a global citizenship, idea or concept or recognition. Once that happens, then we talk about in global things. We talk about global humanity and the global parliament. But all the down the layers of governments, they make their own decision, and it's the world parliament is not supposed to interfere in the subsidiaries, or they call the subsidiarity of that governance. But you can give
Thank you.
more
I just
concrete
well,
answer.
I would give a more essential kind of addition to that. So if you have that kind of a concept of that kind of a democracy, then you will get to the better solutions.
Right.
Then you have the conditions to place better solutions. So you won't, by automatism, by nature, by instinct, by impulse, you won't be having those kind of, oh, what if I do this and I don't agree with you or something like that. No, you have the climate that was set after the World War II in the beginning was good, and the rules were kind of respected. But then after Yugoslavia, then Iraq, then Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, it's not anymore. So and I have this kind of a reviving of the competition, changing the geopolitics in the global system. You have different structure rising, like BRICS countries, brings into question the whole global system. Now it's dynamic again, and it's not good. And it's not, in those kind of conditions, you can only have more conflicts. It urges then China and Russia to say, okay, we don't agree with you. We're going to have our own station there. We're going to go to the moon. And then the US, because they don't want to be excluded, they're going to rush and do it faster. And then you have another space race. Instead of kind of bringing all those interests and the interests of mankind. So in UN Charter it says we the people. We're the people here. I only hear companies, interests of national states, interests of some individuals even. So if you make a climate systemically, then you will have better solutions. You wouldn't have these kind of problems. You would find solutions before the problem comes. I just wanted to add that
So,
much.
yeah, no, I think that's really worthy. I mean, I think that's actually really fantastic. In terms of the moon, for example, and again, I focus on the moon because to me that is one place where some of these things are going to be or sort of like decided or whatever, like precedents or however it's going to be in the next maybe 10 years or so, or maybe even less than that. So I have a question. You I mean, I know I'm trained as an astronomer, and I know that uh, the moon provides a really unique opportunity to do science, various forms of science, but in particular for astronomy. And there is an effort, for example, to protect astronomy because you cannot do anywhere else in the solar system except for the far side of the moon, for example, and there are plans for that. Um, Now, there are these different models. You have mentioned UN Parliament, and you have mentioned a model, for example, the European Union, or other types of things. And law of the sea was also mentioned. I'm curious, what is your take on? And now I'm specifically talking about the moon. Something like the Arctic Treaty, Antarctic Treaty, where you don't have the UN involved, but in some sense it has been set aside for science purposes and for research purposes and things like that. Do you think something like that might work for the moon, or do you think that again for the UN Parliament or something like that would be sort of like the only way to go? And again, my apologies because again I'm still talking about a little bit more specifics, not just a process. But I'm just curious about your take on the Antarctic Treaty. Is that a success model, or it is also foundationally problem because it contains it constitutes a few countries, and again some of them powerful countries involved in there.
I'm not too much familiar with that treaty. Maybe you can add, your comment, but then I'll come back on a global governance view of things.
Yeah, I have expertise in Arctic issues, not Antarctic issues, but I know something
Okay.
about it.
Yeah.
So here's, so it's different. So they forbid mining and drilling there up to some year. So you cannot do that, and it's pure scientific, but it doesn't work. You have from time to time news that, oh, maybe it's a fake news, maybe it's real. Nobody actually has the right information. Everything is done in some kind of a stealth versions. But they say, oh, they blame Russians now. Oh, but they started drilling there. They're going to challenge the whole concept and all that. So why? Again, because you have national interest in front of before science, before sustainability, before democratic way of solutions. So any way you turn it, you can find some solutions, but would they be sustainable until some other interest prevails? So, for example, now
Yeah.
when they found out that there are resources on the moon like helium or this asteroids in the asteroid belt, now everybody wants to get there. It's a race to there. So we can make a profit. We can make power. We can become a technological superpower. The next this and that. But it's all the same thing. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. If you have a concept, if we found a good concept, we would think you had similar situation, similar, not a treaty, but you had this institution built. It's called an Arctic Council to regulate Arctic issues. Now,
Right.
war in Ukraine, Russia is excluded. Nobody wants to deal with Russia. Then Russia said, okay, I'm going to bring my BRICS countries and whoever I found, and they're going to invest with me there. I don't even have to deal with Norwegians or Americans or Canadians there. And now everything might fall apart. Hopefully it won't. But you see, as long as you have this kind of a climate where you have national interests and then it's not going to work.
From again global governance perspective, these treaties are only good until one of the member states decides this is the time to get out because I benefit more. And this is called transactional international law, where you do calculation that okay, if I violate it, what happens if I leave the treaty? What's the cost to me, and what's the benefit? If it is really benefit for me to break the law. And since there is no enforcement, since there is no court, it's easy decision. So you have, for example, United States in International Criminal Court unsigned what they had signed. Or you mentioned Russia leaving which treaty?
Parliamentary Assembly of
Arctic.
OSCE.
Okay. And then another example in the space business is the Moon Treaty. In Moon Treaty last year, Saudi Arabia just walked out. Just said, I'm
That's
not
right.
in it
Yeah.
anymore. So, the success model that you're mentioning is probably because it's not significant yet. It's not, too much. They haven't found, big oil reserves or gold or, So for now, it's just the scientific, and yeah, UN does great in scientific cooperation.
So let me. So we are getting close to the end. I want to ask you. So one of the things in your article, and again for people, I'm going to put a link to it in the description of the video as well. Then again, it was in Space News in May of this year, May 24. One of the things you mentioned is India, and India, of course, is one of the larger space nations. It's actually doing really fantastic work in there, and one of the things that you mention is because India has also expressed its skepticism about the existing system, especially the Security Council and the veto powers in there. And you mentioned that India might be one of the countries that that can bring this issue of the UN Parliament up. And I was wondering, I was curious that India is also close to the US now. They are in, and US is using it as a bulwark against China, for example. Um, why pick India rather than, say, for example, some country like Brazil or others, which are perceived to be more neutralish because you can be in BRICS, for example, and also have good relations with the US and so on and so forth. Although India is also in BRICS, but I'm just curious
Yeah,
how
we
the
apologize. We
process. Yeah.
apologize. India is not the only one, and but India is one of these space treaties that prompted us to put it first.
Well, actually, we flipped the coin and decided it's
Yeah,
India. I'm just kidding, but I'll just give it a bit of a geopolitical overview. India, it's a very kind of a complex answer, but I'll try to make it simple. India is in a best and worst possible place to be that country at the moment. So India has its own very robust and very kind of a fast forward space program. It develops very fast. It it has a very specific geopolitical position in the Pacific. So it's a member of BRICS, but it's also a member of many military or any other alliances in the Pacific from the American side. It has its own space program, but it kind of went on with the Artemis Accords. And they have issues with China. They're cooperating. It's kind of competitive cooperation. I don't know who merged that terminology, but India is kind of a geopolitical balancer or a kind of a catalyst there in the Pacific, and it has a historic reputation inside UN, but also it now became the nation with the biggest number of people worldwide. And it has a right to challenge this Security Council. Why India is not there, or Brazil, but UK is, or France is. What qualifies you there in this moment? So, and the system obviously doesn't work. So there are multi-layer reasons, multiple reasons why India. Why not Brazil or some other country where Canada has a very developed, let's say, space program, but they're known to be in Western alliance. So Brazil is kind of a neutral, but they don't have that kind of a space program, you know, if they have it all. So I think they will probably now go also with fast steps to develop their space program. But India at the moment has the right position to do it, if you know what I mean. But,
okay, yeah, if I may add some points there, is the fact that any kind of UN charter review, constitutional review, uh, would need to be, we need champion states to do it. And in case of Security Council reform, it's been talked about from day one, from 1945 onwards. But it's always been in the context of reform without changing the charter. In other words, change but don't change, which is oxymoron. Now, the last time deep studies were done was during Kofi Annan in early 2000s, and the recommendation came that India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. These four countries should become permanent members of the Security Council. But that was missing the fact that, for example, the Muslim population is the most underrepresented in the Security Council. They typically use a small Arab country like UAE or Saudi, or even Saudi doesn't have much population, Qatar, as the representative of the Muslim country. But if you put Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh together, they're like 700-800 billion people, and they don't have any say in the Security Council. So that's why, back to the beginning, when I said the global issue problem is the type of problem you cannot solve anything unless you solve everything. So it requires a constitutional review. In the constitutional review, it's not just one recommendation that you bring these four countries as permanent members and then problems are solved, and you leave the veto untouched. So in there, then there's going to be negotiations, discussions, and this is not going to a review conference of the UN. It's not going to be a 2 weeks program or a 1 month program. It's going to take 2 3 years rounds of negotiations, and gradually for each one, for each problem, from space resource management to AI to war and peace, they would have to come up with the structure. And what would that structure be called in our domestic government, system? It's the government. We don't have a government. We have a failed state. This is, I think, explains the
So,
chaos we are having.
so can I? We're getting to the end, but can I ask you a question about? I mean, do you think? And this is sort of like my optimistic hat. Maybe, do you think space or issues regarding space? There are other issues that your organization deals with, AI, for example, and other climate change and other things as well. So
Yeah.
these are all global issues. They require global solutions, and hence you are arguing for the UN Parliament and space and how we behave in space. How do we do extractions in space and all of that stuff? That's a global issue. Do you think uh, space is a test case, or it's the better case where you can these issues can come up and people can see the point of the UN Parliament? Or do you think that it has to be everything has to be changed before we do anything? What I'm trying to say is that can space be a test case for implementation of some of these things, or when you make an argument for the UN Parliament? Or do you think that first we have to really change everything and then we come to space? I'm just curious, how do you see the arrow in that
Give
sense?
your opinion
Well,
first.
good question. It
Yeah.
can go both ways, but I think space is I should say, uh, the most plastic example. You can see it very clearly. It's simple,
Ah,
and
yeah.
it's space. It's outer space. It not just revolves around Earth, the whole solar system, the farthest we went. So I think space is a good lakmus paper for it. You're right. We can see, but like Dr. Sharei said, this is a process. It would be great if it's done in years. I think it will need decades, maybe even more. But this is the good way to educate people, and now is the right moment. Everybody's talking about space. Every week, practically, we have some kind of a conference or something on university or in the parliament or something related to outer space. So it's a topic now which is hot topic, and we wanted to use it to make our point. This is just one aspect, but yeah, your question is in place. I agree totally.
A short answer to your question is unfortunately yes. I believe nothing is going to happen solid in terms of having space justice. We call it climate justice. We are not going to have space justice. We are not going to have climate justice. We are not going to have, genocide justice unless everything is fixed through a structure which we are very used to it in democracies, and we are very used to it. We have a parliament, we have a police force, we have a court system. But when it comes to international or global governance, we say, oh no, 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 we don't want to give up our sovereignty to this big brother. But the big brother is now becoming the AI. So in my opinion, it's not. I don't want to discourage you folks in the space business and wanting to implement good governance of it, but I don't think it's going to happen unless we change the whole global governance structure.
All right. So last thing, I mean, and it's really fascinating. I mean, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think this whole thing is actually really fascinating. But I'm going to ask you both if you can say if there is one thing that really concerns you, like in terms of space, you go like, well, this is one thing that is really what's coming that really concerns me, and one reason that you think there is a hope or there is optimism. So how, yeah, so you can pick whoever goes first, but I want one thing that you are most concerned about regarding space and one thing that is a reason for optimism or hope.
You want to give your opinion
Yes,
first?
sure. Thanks. Well, I wrote many academic publications before this article in Space News, and I have this kind of a, because my background is in geopolitics and so on, so I have this kind of a realistic or neo-realistic approach. My biggest fear is that the wars on Earth are gonna just extrapolate on space. They're gonna transfer to the fourth dimension, and you will have like in a couple of centuries fight about some asteroid there or something. Uh, this is not good, and but hope always exists. You see brilliant people like those people from Japan. They came up with a concept which can get all the interests aligned in one basket, put them there, and make everybody happy and make it sustainable. And we don't have to fight. We can all benefit. Nobody's gonna lose. So hope always exists. And I'm afraid that in human nature, and I don't know why, history is repeating, and this is a history of conflict. But even in the darkest ages, you had Renaissance. So, who knows? Maybe overnight, not maybe overnight, but in a short period, it turns around. Uh, the misfortune is that it always has to happen something very, very bad. Uh, Afterwards, it becomes very good. If we can exclude that from our history, we would benefit much more.
Uh, my response to that is, the hope that I have, or one idea that I think would help and not have that uh, catastrophe theory kind of thing is you, people like you. That's why we want to focus on space, because in space there is no borders, as you mentioned. You have a not only global view, you have a universal view of things. I've been in, a peace activist. I've had jobs and works with a peace activist for almost 35 years, and we've always talked among ourselves, with diplomats, with politicians, and the change hasn't come. The change, I think, is going to come for those who are not thinking on those terms. They're thinking of their profession. They're thinking of environment. The environmental movement and space. You guys have a broad view of things. You can understand that how some of you have seen the movies of Star Trek and the Federation. So we are talking
Yeah.
about the UN as a federation. So it's easy for you guys, and you've got the money. The space industry, according to Marco, is a huge industry. And then another newcomer to the game, totally in chaos, totally paranoid, is the AI and the AI governance. And so I think actually you guys are going to help this happen, because to you, borders don't mean anything. You are not nationalistics. The AI guys are doing, their sales all over the world instantly, through internet and other things. And their servers, their farms, the server farms are all over the world. To them, borders is just doesn't make sense. Whereas to a nationalist, to typical diplomat, typical politician, it's my country. It's the nationalism that it stops us from advancing the civilization to the next level.
Well, this is wonderful, and obviously this is music to my ears because you mentioned Star Trek and the Federation, and that is very true. I mean, that's the idea behind that, right? I mean, like that humanity manages to get beyond these issues and think in a universal level. So really hope. That the idea of UN Parliament, I think it's really fantastic, and let's hope that people listen to it, because but it's going to be on the realistic side, it's going to be some effort regarding that, but I really
Yeah,
hope that it can jive in and people can get to the optimistic side of things.
yeah.
Dr.
We need
Sharai,
your help
Dr.
and your
Filijović.
listeners' help. And this is, we think, really the only way to solve all these multiple existential problems.
So we can live long and prosper.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yes, we enjoyed it
Thank
very
you.
much also. Thank you.